Tuolla Lontoossa Jennin mä kohtasin. Halo Vehio, Vehio, ho! Hän on neidosten joukossa kaunihin. Halo Vehio, Vehio, ho!
Well, here we are again, talking about books, writing books, reading books, taking books out from the library, anything you can do with books. Yes, book sales as well. With me today, on my immediate left, is Susanna Natty. And on my right, not yet, is going to be Ray Hildenen. And through the magic of technology, you'll see him pop up, be here with us. Meanwhile, at the ranch house here, I'm going to ask Susanna to review a couple of books she's reading, which I understand are historical nonfiction and about New England. And Susanna, I kind of turn the floor over to you.
Oh, well, thank you, Wayne. Well, you know, you and I were talking a while back, and I had not realized that you had, at some point in your life, worked in a used bookstore.
Yes, 4 books. I didn't need money. I mean, I worked another job for the money and the books I got from the bookstore.
Oh, I didn't even realize you did it just for the joy alone. Well, I mean, that is something. Can you go into a used bookstore without spending way too long?
I could.
Yeah, well, me too. Me too. So I was thinking about genres of reading, and I'm sure we could make an entire list, and even some new genres now. And the historical genre, history, was never one that interested me when I was younger. I was more, I loved mysteries. I loved, literature of various ranges of quality. Children's books, certainly, since I was kind of wrapped up in that.
Well, you must have loved limerick.
Limericks?
Limericks.
Oh, good Lord. Are we going to have a limerick?
No. I just remember some of the limericks your father used to tell.
Oh,
go ahead.
Won't go there.
No, won't go there.
How funny. I'd even forgotten about that. Yeah, he was very funny. So to my great surprise, about 20 years ago, I started actually getting interested in nonfiction. I mean, which includes, of course, history. And I have found that has become maybe the major taker up of my night table space is history and historical fiction. Also love historical fiction. I think when I was going through high school and college, and we studied history, it was like, oh my God, how can this be so boring? And what has kind of turned me around completely is reading really well-written histories. Because I think what I was missing always with the dates and the timelines and the battles and all of that stuff were the people. And there we are. This is why I'm a new and avid fan of works by Nathaniel Philbrick. I gave this book, Travels with George, to my husband for Christmas because I'd read a good review of it, hoping that it would make its way into my hands at some point.
Tell us who this George is.
Oh, George. Well, you probably, if I can do a screenshot later, but I will tell you right now, this is a marvelously designed jacket cover. Travels with George in Search of Washington and His Legacy. And what you have up at the top is the rear view mirror of a car, and in it, those famous eyes and powdered hair from, I think, the portrait by John Singleton Copley, maybe, or Gilbert Stuart, I think, maybe. I think it's just a terrific take on this, because this book, it follows Nathaniel Philbrick and his lovely wife as they travel around the original 13 colonies, which became the United States, and went to all the places George had visited. You know all those places that say George Washington slept here? It's true. He did this incredible thing, which I had no idea about, which managed to knit this nascent country together by doing a presidential tour after he became president. He didn't do it all at once. He started, I think, with New England. And the last travels he made were in the South. And the stories of where he went to and the different political, current and what people were pushing for and what was almost ready to pull the country apart before it had even started are all in here. And he's very amusing too in the passages with his wife. There were some laugh out loud moments. So big fan of his.
I'm gonna throw you for a loop.
Okay.
And just arbitrarily ask you to look on page 63.
Okay.
This is random. We're not rehearsed this at all. Just picking 63 and see if you can find a paragraph or a line. Not necessarily one of those hilarious ones you said, but just that shows a sampling of the way he writes. And again, we've just arbitrarily picked
All right.
page 63.
Well, we have here Washington beginning his New England tour. So this is the first one he made. And, he didn't have a whole entourage of, football carriers or anything like that. So here it describes that.
As a president?
This is him as president.
Okay.
Yes. Washington began his New England tour, much as we had done, in relative solitude. There were no jubilant crowds, no military escort picking up annoying clouds of dust. You can imagine he would have been swallowing a lot of dust behind the horses in front of him. Just the three men who would be holding down the fort in his absence: Henry Knox, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, who accompanied him for a few miles before turning back to the city. From then on, it was just Washington and what he called his retinue.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you. That's a good sampling. It intrigues me. By the way, as we're on book with Gloucester Bookies, Henry Knox, you mentioned, was a Boston bookseller.
I did not know that.
Before he became a prominent revolutionary soldier. The revolution drew people from all occupations and ranks,
Yes.
including booksellers. Please go on. You have another book.
Well,
Also by
speaking of,
Nathaniel.
National Philbrick, Nathaniel Philbrick. And all these people from various walks of life who were part of the revolution. Boy, is that sketched out in Nathaniel Philbrick's book, Bunker Hill. Now, this is great. There's a trilogy here, which I'm not going to be able to remember all of, but it covers that period from the Boston Massacre, Bunker Hill, up through the rest of the Revolutionary War. So a trilogy by Nathaniel Philbrick. And my husband and I celebrate our wedding anniversary in May. And he said, my husband, it would be a great anniversary present. Why don't we get that set of 3 books by Nathaniel Philbrick? And I thought at the time, yeah, okay. Sounds like a great anniversary present for you. But as it happens, I picked up Bunker Hill, the first of the trilogy, about 3 weeks ago, and was hooked on the first page.
Well, do that.
Okay.
First page. I have read books, by the way, and if the first page intrigued me so much, I'm telling you, I would put it down. The next day, reread the first page.
Yes.
And just go that way until I was satisfied that I had really milked all the pleasure possible out of the wonderful first page. And only one book ever succeeded more than 30 days. It was by Robert B. Parker, and I think it was called Love and Glory. If you ever get the book, the novel, Love and Glory by Robert B. Parker, you'll first page, you can read it and reread it and reread it without going further into the book for a good long time. And then finally you can turn the page and start in with the whole book, which was pretty good too. But give the first page of this marvelous Bunker Hill.
So the title of this section is Preface, The Decisive Day. On a hot, almost windless afternoon in June, a 7-year-old boy stood beside his mother and looked out across the green islands of Boston Harbor. To the northwest, sheets of fire and smoke rose from the base of a distant hill. Even though the fighting was at least 10 miles away, the concussion of the great guns burst like bubbles across his tear-streaked face. At that moment, John Adams, the boy's father, was more than 300 miles to the south at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Years later, the elder Adams claimed that the American Revolution had started not with the Boston Massacre or the Tea Party or the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord and all the rest, but had been effected before the war commenced in the minds and hearts of the people. For his son, however, the decisive day was June 17, 1775, and that was Bunker Hill.
I can see why you are identifying with that moment and that boy standing there of for him.
Yeah.
That was the day.
That was the day.
And I think later in the show I'll tell you about one day in Lanesville that was a big day for me. But what I love these things, but these historical nonfiction. And one of the nonfictions on George Washington, which you may not have read, but you may want to read in the future, gives you a little coloration of George Washington in a different way. See if you've heard of it.
Okay.
It's called George Washington's Expense Account.
No.
Yes, it's a real book, and it's co-authored by Marvin Kitt. Marvin Kittman was kind of a
was the other author George Washington?
yes.
Of course.
Who wrote the expense book. And Marvin Kittman went to the, I think it was the National Archives or the library, whichever one possesses the actual account book that nobody ever reads about George Washington and the Revolution. Unknown, perhaps, maybe it's mentioned in these books. When George Washington was appointed commander of all the forces in the Revolution by the Continental Congress, they said, more or less, what should we pay? And George Washington said, I will not accept the salary. He's not going to be paid anything. Whoa, big applause. I will only charge my... And what a book that was. I'll tell you, Marvin Kittman, the reason it's co-authored is because Marvin Kittman gives little asides and comments. Believe me, the Continental Congress never, ever let anybody work for their expenses again. They capped them with a salary. George Washington was...
Wonderful.
Marvin Kittman says that George Washington was not only the father of his country, he was the father of the expense account. In other words, all these things you find in expense account, like you wonder why anybody should have to pay you for that.
Oh my Lord! Yes.
Transportation from Martha to the battlefield or something. It's like, whoa! Why do we pay for that? Somebody else to come and be with you.
That's fantastic.
And it was beautiful because one time somewhere there was, in those days, letters had seal wax, red wax. You'd seal the thing with wax. And Washington had three lines describing the kind of red wax that was, how long it was and everything. And, 6 cents, whatever it was.
That sounds expensive.
But then, and then it says, dinner for an army, 10,000 pounds.
Oh!
It's like he said the secret of expense accounts, George Washington figured out, was to be in fine detail about every tiny little expense. And then when you actually have a huge expense, you just boom.
That is utterly fantastic.
Anyhow, so you get Marvin Kittman and George Washington.
Yes, I definitely want to get that.
Because it is a little, it's an aside. It's the actual book. It's a historical book in that.
How fantastic.
Have you more for us than you want to?
Well, I'm just, I think the reason I've gotten so interested in a well-written history is that it really brings home that, everything, nothing changes, everything's the same. What is that French phrase? Plus ça change, plus something. Never mind.
You could do it.
Something like that.
You had Madame Picon.
Yeah, I know, but I can't remember the rest of the phrase. I mean, reading about what the activists were doing, the revolutionaries. I mean, Sam Adams and John Hancock and what was his name? Joseph Warren, who was a name to me that meant nothing, and now he's the central figure in here. And their differences of opinion and their humanity. And what I was most surprised by in reading this was to find myself really put back as though I was there and to be experiencing it in real time, not knowing where it's going to end up. We get the sanitized, 5-step history. We don't get all the confusion and the muck. And here it is, all the confusion and the muck. And I felt sympathy, a great deal of sympathy toward the loyalists who back when I was in high school was like, oh, they were the bad guys. They were just folks who were trying to figure out what the heck is going on and viewing this as a temporary unpleasantness, not the founding of a country, which was like the founding myth. But so it's fabulous. I love all of that sort of gritty, granular detail. And this Philbrick is so good at teasing out the connections and these lovely little things. I just. So what is that saying? Is so many books and so little time? I feel like I thank my husband for the idea of the trilogy of books for our anniversary because I know I'm going to want to pick up the next 2 after this.
Nathaniel Philbrick, yes, Philbrick or Philbrick?
Philbrick.
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 And, I recall. I think he's written more than these two. I recall him.
Oh, he's quite a few. Like The Endeavor,
popular.
maybe, or was that with somebody else?
No, he's a very, very popular author for the reasons you described. Lucid, come to life, back, resurrecting characters.
Yes.
Always a mix, I think, of very well known, but only in a gross fashion, not in angular, as you described it. Like George Washington, his pictures on the bill. But we see him every day, but we don't really get beneath the surface.
Right.
There's those celebrities, if you will, and then there's the totally obscure people you never even heard their name, and at best they're, and you want to know so much more about them. And amazingly, there is enough material that he found, scraped together, to talk about in detail, confess.
Well, it is, and it makes me admire researchers who can take these little bits of detail. I've been availing myself of the microfiche at the Sawyer Free Library. That's a trip.
Yes.
It's really fun to go back, and I've been reading about 1914 Gloucester Daily Times, and once again, the more things change, the more things stay the same. It makes me feel better about being in the middle of historical times, I think.
Yeah, it does. You're not alone, see?
No, not alone at all. So I don't know if the last time we were here, I mentioned this book called Looking for Trouble.
Looking for Trouble.
By Virginia Cowles.
Right.
Cowles. Just speaking of being in real time. I know my time is going to be up in just a second.
Don't worry about it. Virginia Cowles.
Virginia Cowles.
Do you know anything more? A New England author, or what?
She is. She was a journalist during World War II in the 1930s. And stop me if this sounds familiar. I think I have, because she was writing about the side with Franco and the side with and mentioned that she was there in Germany during Hitler's time, and then went on to Finland.
Right.
And saw the continuation war and the Winter War.
Like one of these people you can't believe. She was everywhere.
Everywhere.
At the
So
time.
forgive me for duplicating a previous
No,
recommendation, but
looking
it just
for
shows
trouble.
how strongly I feel about this. It's an incredible book.
I'm delighted that you can recommend it again.
Yes, again.
All right. Where were we? I was going to tell you about somebody you vaguely may remember, and people in the audience may
Oh, is this your
remember.
historic event in Lanesville?
Well, it'll get to it. The drumbeat is on the way by way of Sawyer Free Library has books over there available to you at no charge. Free. You can read them by Spalding Gray. Spalding Gray, Gray. Spalding Gray made a name for himself on Broadway and places, and also made movies on the basis of what we have here. In other words, a table and a glass of water, a notepad, a spiral notebook, and a microphone, and he talked. His autobiographical monologues were hilarious, moving, and they just included tragedy and comedy, and it was wonderful. A one-man show, but it wasn't a play, and it wasn't scripted. He was just speaking ad lib, but sometimes look at his notepad for whatever he had in a memoir or journal fashion. Spalding Gray. Now, he's my inspiration for the following, which I promised you I would say. My story of Lanesville in 1953, true story. And here I am with my water and my table and my microphone, and I'm going to be saying this to you. I was, 1953, I was 5 years old, and I was my best friend was Dale Pallelli. You remember Dale Pallelli at the Lane School?
Yes.
I went down to, in fact, his mother was Virginia Pallelli, as some people know, as a famous, really legendary nurse at the Addison Gilbert Hospital. And his father was Louis Pallelli, who was the veterans agent for many years. Good people. In those days, Lanesville, as now, is filled. It was good people. But anyway, so I went down to the Pallelli's home and knocked on the door, and nobody was home. This was unusual because I always, can Dale come out to play, whatever. Nobody's home. Now, I'm 5 years old, nobody's home, and I didn't really have a busy life otherwise. So I went to they had a driveway, long driveway to the barn with a garage, with a big oak tree, shady oak tree. This was in summertime. So it was hot. So I sat in the shade waiting, imagined that Dale would come back home because he'd tell me he was. So I waited in the shade of the oak tree, looking up the driveway was something of an incline to, if you can visualize it, still exists, of course, the corner of Washington Street and Andrew, which in those days was McPherson's store.
Yes.
Right? So I'm looking up the driveway, waiting for Dale's car, Dale's family himself to come in by, and instead, one moment, up in front of me was a cowboy in full regalia, black outfit, black hat, ammunition belt, and the holsters with the gun. It was Hopalong Cassidy. Again, as soon as I say the name, a certain generation will say, "Oh, wow."
Yeah.
You.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
But others say, "Who?" Because they're born too late. In the 1930s and 40s, one man in Hollywood made more movies than anybody else. They were cranking movies out every couple of weeks, West. And Hopalong Cassidy, otherwise known as William Boyd, was in the Guinness Book of World Records for the most movies in which anybody starred. That'll never happen again because they don't have movie stars cranking them out to a week. And so he's got to be the enduring record for a movie star in movies that you go to the theater and see. The star is William Boyd. And that was in the 30s and 40s. And he made the transition. He had a weekly radio show. He also had television. And kids loved the Hopalong Cassidy,
Yeah.
weekly Hopalong Cassidy show in the early 1950s. About ready to go retire to his ranch, but not quite, in 1953. And he made a bit of a tour, including Gloucester, in the summer of 1953. But obviously, he and his driver made the wrong turn at Grant Circle and went down to Lanesville, because there's nothing. So as I imagine, his driver was in McPherson's store getting directions to the place they're supposed to go down to, downtown, where Dale was, by the way.
Oh, my.
With many other people, but not me. I didn't know about it. His parents read the newspapers, and so. But anyway, so I'm under the oak tree, and Hopalong Cassidy's looking for kids, and I'm the only kid in town, in sight. So I'm down there, and of course, my reaction, yours might vary. I'm petrified. I'm catatonic. I can't move. I'm seeing Hopalong Cassidy up there, and I'm scared to death. But he wasn't going to have any of that. So, I mean, I would have to demonstrate. He got up and did the routine with his arms up like that, like you challenge somebody. And he said, well, I'm not going to come down there to you. And that was the clue. I was supposed to go up and see him.
Yeah.
So I made the slowest walk possible up that hill to get to Hopalong Cassidy, where he instructed me. And you can look online if you say Hopalong Cassidy's 10 Commandments, I think it's called. Hopalong Cassidy, one of them was respect your elders. Well, I didn't know it at the time, but that's what he was. He looked at me and he said, respect your elders. I was being chewed out by a Hollywood star. And then he tousled my hair and gave me his postcard. His Hopalong signed postcard by Hopalong Cassidy.
Oh,
and
my
let me
God.
go, which made me run home. And when I ran home, I ran in the door, spoke to my mother, and I showed her the postcard. And she said, where did you get that? And I said, from Hopalong Cassidy. And she said, oh, the things you say. And she never believed it. Now you look in the microfiche of the Times.
Okay.
Please don't look at 1914. Look at
1953. Okay. Summertime.
Summertime.
Okay.
And you'll find a picture of Hopalong Cassidy with a little caption that said something like, Hopalong Cassidy visited the place in whatever date it was. And that's when my mother believed me.
Wow.
That's when my mother believed me. I had confirmation, documented proof in the Gloucester Daily Times.
Oh,
But,
my God. I cannot believe that I'm sitting next to somebody who met Hopalong Cassidy. Is that like 2 degrees of separation or 1 degree of separation?
And Matt, he spoke. He chewed me out.
Thrilled.
Yes. Yes, that was really true.
What an icon. Saturday mornings.
And so I'm thinking that would do it. You could do a Spalding Gray on that. By the way, Spalding Gray, I love his book because he manages to take a subject and really tell it in a unique way, give it a twist in some way. He was in Rhode Island. He was born in Rhode Island. He went home to Rhode Island in his adulthood, and his father was older, and he and his father decided, or perhaps he decided more than his father, that he should get to know better and reconcile of any differences. And he brought his father to the seashore of Rhode Island in some cottage that he rented, I suppose. And he tells about it in one of his books, I think, Swimming to Cambodia or one of those books.
Oh, wow.
And the beautiful part, it's a story with a sound effect. And the sound effect is hilarious because it's foghorn. You know, when the fog comes in, that's when it triggers these lighthouse foghorn. Ooh, oh, things, whatever like that. And so he's talking seriously with his father, and he's saying, Dad, I was brought up as a Catholic, but my brother was brought up as a Protestant, and nobody ever explained that. Ooh, ah. And the father says, well, there's no particular reason. It's just the way it was. Ooh, ah. And then he says, but there must have been some reason. Was it both sides of the family or? Ooh, ah. And goes on. It's a wonderful, wonderful sketch. And just an example of the man's genius. And you have to respect that. And it's free. It's free. Get that if you can. The book I've come, you speak of nonfiction, is a biography of a man whom I never heard of. I asked if you ever heard of, named Sergei Korolev. Okay?
Not ringing a bell.
Not ringing a bell. But and then I ask you about these events. The first human object to orbit. Know that?
Oh, yes.
You remember?
There was a song in the 1958 or 59. It was about Sputnik.
Sputnik?
Yeah, popular song. It was great.
And the first man into space.
Mm-hmm.
Yuri Gagarin. It was a Soviet, Russian. The first object ever to be hurled and land on the moon.
Yeah.
The first object ever to be
yes.
hurled, land Mars. This guy.
Whoa.
Korolev. The space program in Russia was hand-me-downs and, minimal stuff. It wasn't big like in the United States. It wasn't funded very well. In fact, the way this guy operated, he would go to Khrushchev and say, look at this. And it was like newspaper articles on the new space budget in the United States, pictures, all that.
Wow.
He says, they're going to overcome us if you don't.
Wow.
So then he weaseled out some money out of the Soviet treasury.
How did you run across this? Were you looking for it or what?
I had no idea. Somehow I ran into his name or first man in space or something like that. And but as often there's a twist. And the twist is he was cruelly and abusively treated in Stalinist time. He was arrested. He was sent to Siberia. He did. I'm going to read a little section of this book, but just to you say why would anybody go to work, go to town, and really help Russia in the space race after that?
Yeah.
But here he is. I got
Why do you look? That song was Telstar.
Telstar Baby.
Yeah. Anyway,
Baby.
Go on.
Still, yes, there are those who remember that. Korolev was shipped off to Polimia, which is part of Siberia, frozen Siberia, average temperature 40 degrees below, where there was a surface gold mine. These were to dig alleged gold, but it was frozen mud. It was frozen, and it put it in a wheelbarrow, and somebody would truck it off gold or not. He spent 5 months there during winter, cutting trees, digging, pushing wheelbarrows. It was beastly work. Didn't make food either. And in those days, prisoners in Siberia were unlucky and lucky. They were all unlucky. But the unlucky ones had, when they were sentenced, like going to be sentenced to 10 years at hard labor in Siberia, which really meant be dying in 6 months or a year. But you without the right to communicate with them, or you would be given the right to communicate. He was one of the lucky ones. He was given the right to communicate. So he's writing his wife and high officials, people that he knew, basically appealing his case and saying, I'm guilty of nothing, and I love the system, and I'll help it out. And finally, that worked. Within a year, he was retried in Moscow without being present. But it didn't matter whether you're present or not, because the sentence was already. He was reduced in the amount of time he was sentenced, and he was given the good news. You can go back to Moscow. Well, how do I do that? It's like there's no trains, and I'm 100 miles from the next village, and well, you find your way. So not like walk, you can't. You're a prisoner. So he the prisoners in the place took up a collection to give him sweaters and stuff like that. Not for him, but for trading to get, transportation. Okay.
Wow.
He stopped. He stopped the truck, and the driver said he'd take him to Magadan, which is the place for the train, ship. But he'd have to hand over his sweater to give him the sweater. When he gets to Magadan, he learns the last ship of the season had already left. In other words, this is frozen over, dangerous. They don't ship certain. But it was lucky because it turned out a few days later there was a heavy storm, and everyone on that ship that was lost. So he waited the winter, but he didn't have an automatic place to stay.
No.
He found an army barrack. It was 45 or 50 below zero. He was discovered and kicked out.
Oh, good Lord.
Found another barrack, but he had to leave that one. Flimsy clothes, he was freezing. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. Then a kind of a miracle happened. He was walking along a path in the snow when he came upon a loaf of bread, a warm loaf. Unexplained, but he ate until he got hiccup, walked back to the first barrack, went to sleep under a bed where he would be hidden, woke up, his clothes were frozen, drowned. People in the barracks were under police. He asked, "Who played this joke? Giving me?"
Yeah.
"Are you crazy?" I was asked. No, there was nobody would own up to having anything to do with it. He worked as a laborer, a shoe repairman, and anything else until spring. Then he headed back to the main. On the way back, so Jervy, his teeth fell out. Yeah. Somebody appears, an old man appears, says, "I'll make you." It was May. Set up a guy under a tree, sun, away, and we came back. The guy had side.
Incredible.
Got the bleeding stopped. And I'm just saying, this book has the whole story of the man behind the race to the moon that was successful.
Wow.
They made it happen in Russia first. Korolev, it's by a man named James Harford, Harford. Now, momentarily, we're going to interrupt while Raymond reappears at my side. Thank you. Bear with us. Well, through the magic of television, popping up at my immediate left is actually Ray Hildenan. And thank you. And what have you today for us?
Well, thanks for having me again. I love being here. Hello, Susie.
Hi.
So today I want to make a quick note in passing of the death of Elizabeth II, even though we won't be talking, we won't be hearing much in 3 months perhaps. But I wanted people to think about the history of this woman instead of the gossipy books that are currently being read. So I just wanted people to know Peter Ackroyd's book, The History of England, Volume 6, Innovation is the title, and it deals with this woman as purely a historical way, in a purely historical way, by examining the historical record only. Nothing about whether or not, what she thought of Princess Diana, what she thought about her family, what she thought about her uncle. No, none of that nonsense, because she never spoke about these things. So here's this book. That's all I'm going to say about it, but it's very readable. And Peter Ackroyd, of course, is famous as a literary historian.
Tell us more, by the way, about the Booker Prize.
Yes, and so passing on to that, within this past week, we had the announcement of the 5 shortlisted titles for the Booker Prize. And so what I decided to do today is to present, now before you groan, my audience, I want you to know that I have selected 3 titles of the 5 that in fact are very readable, that speak to us in today's terms, and that deal with topics that are relevant to today. But most of all, they're exciting and they're lovely to read. So I'm going to start right off with a wonderfully precious little book, Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. It is the shortest book ever nominated for the Booker Prize.
Oh.
And so those of you who like a quick read, I'm going to tell you, I could not put this book down.
Oh.
I forced myself to about 20 pages from the end because I said, Raymond, if you finish this, you're not going to be able to keep the ending from anybody. So I don't know what happens. But, okay, Small Things Like These.
But it's not a mystery story.
It is.
It is.
In part. In part, it's a spiritual story. In part, is a very relevant story about the harm that institutions can do to young children, a topic that's very much in the news. So Bill Furlane is the hero of the story, and he's a very poor Irish coal mine. He's a coal deliverer. In other words, he delivers coal bins to various places in his town. He's a very, very basic person. He's a very kind person, a very loving person. But he sees something in his delivery of coal at the local nunnery, and he's shocked by it. But what can he do about it? That's what this book is all about. It's a wonderful look at human beings who are faced with a dilemma, and what do they do about it? And
so this is unforgettable character.
Unforgettable. And Small Things Like These refers, in fact, to the small children who are in the convent. But then at the end, about midway through, it changes. It becomes even more of a mystery because Bill, the protagonist, begins to wonder about his own story. How did he come to be? And there's a mystery there. And it keeps you going from page to page to page. It's a wonderful book. So Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. Also, I wanted to tell you...
Small things come in big packages.
Yes,
big
I wanted
packages
to... I did want to mention that I also chose books that are, number 1, available in our local bookstores.
Yay.
And are available in the libraries, so all of the KPN libraries. The other 2, which I won't even mention...
So you're saying these 3 books people can get for free at the library?
Yes.
Okay.
And for sale at the local
For
bookstores.
sale at the local
The other 2 books, which I'm not even going to talk about, are currently not yet published in the United States. Or if they are, they've only recently been published. So they're more difficult to get. Now, you're going to find this interesting.
But can you get... You're
Yes,
at
right
can
here. I
you
bought
get-
one myself.
Can you get trees in the library?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
So I'm going to start off with trees by saying, please don't confuse this title with the Overstory by Richard Powers, which, and you're going to find this interesting, Wayne, because you did a little talk last year on the importance of cover photography and cover. Well, this book ran into publishing difficulties in the United States because it originally had a tree with a large, like umbrella-like, and that some people thought was a violation of not necessarily copyright, but artistic copyright, because it resembled the Overstory, the book by Richard Powers. And that, of course, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize and won the Pulitzer Prize, if I'm not mistaken.
But this one now is redesigned. No trees
Look,
were harmed.
it's rather plain.
No trees,
Look how plain it is.
no trees were harmed in the making of this
Very-
Oh, yes, they were.
I think they still were, yes. So, what is The Trees about? And despite its plain cover, it's a fascinating story, a multi-level story. I'm going to jump ahead in the story because, in fact, there's a tie-in to the murder of Emmett Till back in the 1950s.
With trees.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because the trees in the background are actual spiritual trees. I'm not going to get into that because it sounds almost too kinky or spiritual, but it is not. This man goes from page to page. His chapters are only 3 pages long.
Do this for me. We did this similar in our thing. Read the first paragraph.
Excellent.
Just the first paragraph of the book, Trees. Give her an idea. The reader's, the writer's ability to capture readers here.
Unfortunately, one is rather long, but that's okay.
All right.
I didn't bring my
didn't
reading
say the whole
glasses. So,
page.
no.
Big paragraph.
Money, Mississippi.
Money, Mississippi. Is a town?
Yes.
Right.
And it looks exactly like it sounds. Named in that persistent Southern tradition of irony and with the attendant tradition of nescience, the name becomes slightly sad, a marker of self-conscious ignorance that might as well be embraced because, let's face it, it isn't going away. Now, money can be compared to several other stories. People think that it rings of Faulkner and Mark Twain, but he is his own voice. And so what he has done is he's created a story in which the Emmett Till murder, for which there really was never justice, he brings justice to it by haunting, in these pages, by haunting the descendants of the people who were involved in the, and in fact, it is based on one murder in this small town that suddenly becomes a series of murders. But the book is not focused on murders, it's focused on redemption. How does he bring, like, a closure, if you will, to the murder of Emmett Till and what it has to do with today's society? So Percival Everett has written over 20 books. Each one of them is very different. Erasure was one, which was turned into a very good movie.
Let me ask,
yes.
because I think people may be confused as I am.
Oh dear.
In this way, the Booker Prize is a British award, and the books are published in.
Okay, let me clarify
So
that.
this is about Mississippi.
Yes, okay, let me clarify that for you. About 2 years ago, possibly 3, the Booker Prize Committee changed their focus to any work published in the English language that was published in England, but in the English language. So we now have Indian authors who are who can be in India. Before they had to be located in England, but now, and so these are all these 3 are American authors, and that is another. I think that could be a plus for them, for our audience, who perhaps may find these long, tedious novels that are full of intellectual tidbits a little bit dry for their taste. And so here's 2 that fit this sort of wider dimension of books that are very readable. His narrative skills are immense, by the way, Percival Everett's. And so in just a couple pages, he covers an immense amount of material. And his characters, one of his characters, and as a matter of fact, we meet him on the Tallahatchie Bridge. I thought that was a fictional bridge from the song back in the 50s and the 60s. Well, he brings that as well as a plethora of other little anecdotes into his story, but he makes them real, he captures them.
What's
So,
the third book that you
okay.
have for us?
We have Oh, William by Elizabeth Stroud. I believe many of our listeners have read Elizabeth Stroud. She has won the Pulitzer Prize, and she is also has written a couple books that have been turned into a PBC series. Her other one such book is called The Life of Lucy Barton, I believe, and it has been turned into a Broadway play starring Laura Linney. And it was also very well received on the British stage. What is O. William about? It again is short. It is only a little more than 200 pages. It reads very quickly. It is about this woman who is reflecting back on her marriage to her first husband, a marriage that did not go well, and she was very much blindsided by her husband's infidelity, that for 5 years of their marriage, 5 years of her marriage, her husband had a mistress, and she knew nothing about it, even though this woman was a friend of hers. So, in previous installments, this woman, Lucy, is written about as a minor character, but here she takes stage as a full-blown character. And in her previous incarnations, Elizabeth Stroud, the author, has her rather as a mordant creature, a very bitter, a very sarcastic creature. But in this book, she comes alive because she reassesses her husband and she finds so many good things about him. And it's very topical because, as it turns out, this woman's second husband, by the name of David, suddenly passes away from cancer. And what happens is her husband comes back into her life, and they agree to settle down as friends only during the COVID era, because they're both terribly afraid of catching it, and their friends have caught it.
Wow.
And they both are at severe risk for catching it. So they go to a small town in Maine. And a lot of Elizabeth Stroud's fiction takes place in Maine. Yeah. And what's really interesting is it's almost like a free-flowing, it's a roman à clef, but it is also an interior monologue. Everything in this book is what she thinks, but she speaks it out loud as she thinks. So it's very conversation-driven, and that makes it easy to understand. You understand when she says something like, "Oh, William, what did you do that for?" The reader knows because she's let them into her interior life as well as that of her husband.
Wow, 3 very different books, but in different ways seem to be really have a lot
They're
of
all
appeal.
short. They're all quick to read. To get back to Trees, it's almost as though the author, Percival Everett, was thinking of sort of a movie script as he wrote this, because everything is a scene. Everything in 2 or 3 pages. He sets the scene, the action happens, and then he jumps to another topic, including there were some interesting characters, including 2 African-American detectives who come from Philadelphia to investigate the murders that our protagonist in this book comes across. And that may remind you of another film about a detective who came down from Philadelphia and was portrayed. Wayne is nodding his head.
It goes back to the 60s or 70s.
Yes.
Which one?
And
Call Me Mister? Is that the one?
that's the second one. The first one is In the Still of the Night. No, I'm sorry, I just drew a blank.
Probably is this still?
With William Steiger and a host of other people. Anyways, it's a lot of.
I'm going to jump
Yes.
to the.
Yes.
Speaking of movies, this one that is O. William.
Yes.
Does that strike you as movie material too?
It could be, but it could be difficult because it's not to read, but to envision. How do you dramatize a woman's thought? But it would be a challenge, but it would be fascinating.
Well, it's interesting about I've read some books where I feel like the author is putting out a big flag to Hollywood saying, "I'm setting the scene for you."
Here you go.
And did you find that was behind this, or is this experimental guy? Because you tell me he writes also.
Yes,
He's just
yes.
saying, what? How does this work?
Yes, and it's a thought that came upon me as I actually read each chapter. And I'm thinking, why are these chapters so short? And I said, well, maybe this is like a movie script, excepting it isn't, because he is in tight control of his writing and in tight control of his characters. He's like, but in a way, he directs the characters because it is a work of fiction. Even though there are true characters, the character called Granny C is in fact his own redoing, the author's own redoing of the woman who accused the murderer, who accused Emmett Till of being, that he made passes at her back in the 1950s. And yet, on her deathbed, she confesses, I may have been mistaken about that. And those, apparently her confessions are going to be published in the year 2036. And I mean, the horror of that story is also brought out in this book because the murders mimic the way, not mimic, they actually sort of, they actually, not just mimic, but without giving something away, they sort of mesmerize our readers as though this really is Emmett Till, who's being murdered again and again and again.
All right.
Well, you're not helping my night table, either of you. I could see the stack is growing. Thank you.
Well, the same with me, and I was so glad, as I said, and this is for our audience, that all of these books are available and so readable.
I appreciate what you've done today. Help me and the audience to a whole new realm of books to look into. Thank you, Susanna. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you, Wayne.
Ray's always like the mild-mannered reporter that turns into Superman once he shows up at the show. You've got everything. You're all effervescent and ready to tell us about these books, which is a pleasure to see. Thank you, and until our next session, keep writing, keep reading. Thank you. It's a Gloucester Bookies. Signing off.
Thank you.
Tuolla Lontoossa jännin mä kohtasin. Halo Vepi, oho. Hän on neitosten joukossa kaunihin. Halo Vepi, oho. Suukon kirsikka silmät niin mustat kuin yö. Ja ne loisti kuin tuikkiva tähti.